November 2025. In the United States, 3 death row inmates met their fates. Over a single week, 2 states carried out executions that closed decades-old cases, each with its own harrowing story. In this documentary, we chronicle the final chapter of these prisoners' lives, their crimes, trials, last meals, and last words, with a respectful and factual lens. Welcome to Deadline Files. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support means a great deal, and it keeps these important stories alive. Before we begin, please note, the accounts include details of violent crimes which some viewers may find disturbing. Our aim is to present the facts and context surrounding each case with respect for the victims, their families, and the gravity of these events. Bryan Frederick Jennings, November 13th, 2025, Florida. Our first case takes us to Florida State Prison in Rayford on the evening of November 13th, 2025. Bryan Frederick Jennings, age 66, was executed by lethal injection for a crime committed nearly half a century earlier. At 6:20 p.m., prison officials pronounced Jennings dead, making him the record-breaking 16th inmate executed in Florida that year. Brian Jennings was a U.S. Marine, 24 years old in 1979, home on leave in Brevard County. On the surface, just another young man serving his country. But on the night of May 10th, he became something else entirely. Just after midnight, Jennings approached a quiet residential home. Inside, 6-year-old Rebecca and Kunash slept peacefully in her bedroom. Jennings removed the window screen. He climbed inside. He lifted the child from her bed and carried her into the darkness. He drove Rebecca to an isolated canal, where he assaulted her and ultimately caused her death. By morning, Rebecca's body had been discovered. The community was paralyzed with horror. Investigators worked quickly. Shoe prints at the scene matched Jennings' footwear. His fingerprints were lifted from the child's windowsill. When police located him later that day, ostensibly for an unrelated traffic warrant, he was soaked with water. No explanation, just wet clothes and nervous energy. Jennings was arrested. In custody, he couldn't keep quiet. Over time, he confided details of the crime to fellow inmates. The case against him was airtight. The legal saga that followed was unprecedented. Jennings was convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, sexual assault, and burglary in 1980. A jury sentenced him to death, but a procedural error overturned the verdict on appeal. A second trial, another death sentence. The Florida Supreme Court upheld it, until the U.S. Supreme Court stepped in, ordering reconsideration. The sentence was reversed again. Finally, in March 1986, a third trial delivered a conviction and death sentence that held. Brian Jennings had been sentenced to death 3 separate times for the same crime. He also received multiple life sentences for the rape, kidnapping, and related charges. Then came the waiting. 39 years on death row. Jennings' attorneys filed motion after motion. In 2022, his lawyer died, leaving him temporarily without counsel. When Governor Ron DeSantis signed his death warrant in October 2025, Jennings' legal team argued he'd been denied due process, that the warrant was invalid because he lacked representation when it was signed. The Florida Supreme Court rejected the claim. On November 12, 2025, one day before the scheduled execution, the U.S. Supreme Court denied his final stay request. There were no more legal moves to make. The execution would proceed. Jennings woke at 4 a.m., his last day on earth. Prison staff brought him his final meal, a cheeseburger, French fries, and a soda. Nothing elaborate, nothing meaningful, just fast food. As evening approached, witnesses filed into the viewing chamber at Florida State Prison. Media representatives, prison officials, Nobody from Rebecca's family chose to attend or make a public statement. Jennings was strapped to the gurney. A line was inserted into his arm. When the warden asked if he had any final words, Jennings gave a single, emphatic response. No. No apology. No remorse. No acknowledgement of the little girl whose life he stole 46 years earlier. At 6:02 p.m., the lethal injection drugs began flowing. Observers watched as his chest heaved. His arms twitched. For a couple of minutes, his body fought the chemicals. Then he went still. At 6:20 p.m., the physician pronounced Bryan Frederick Jennings dead. The execution proceeded without complications. Rebecca and Kunash would have been 52 years old in 2025. She never got to grow up, never got to go to school dances, graduate, fall in love, have children of her own. All of that was stolen by a man who waited nearly half a century to face the consequences of his actions. Governor DeSantis' office issued a brief statement. Justice had finally been delivered. For Rebecca's family, the execution likely brought little comfort. She was still gone. But perhaps, after 46 years, they could finally close this chapter. Florida's 16th execution of 2025 was followed only a day later by another execution. This time, in a different state and by a method the modern United States had rarely seen. Steven Corey Bryant, November 14, 2025, South Carolina. The night of November 14, 2025, South Carolina carried out an execution in a way not used anywhere else in the country that year. Steven Corey Bryant, a 44-year-old man convicted of a 2004 triple murder, was executed by firing squad at Broad River Correctional Institution in Columbia. He was pronounced dead at 6:05 p.m. after 3 volunteer executioners fired their rifles, marking South Carolina's 3rd firing squad execution of the year, a grim distinction, as the state had only recently re-enabled alternative execution methods due to issues obtaining lethal injection drugs. Bryant's path to the death chamber began with a week-long crime spree in October 2000 for that terrorized rural Sumter County. Only 23 years old at the time, Bryant killed 3 people over 5 days, in what prosecutors described as a calculated series of murders. His first victim was Clifton Gainey, 36, a co-worker whom Bryant shot on October 9, 2004, before burglarizing Gainey's home. 2 days later, Bryant targeted 62-year-old Willard T.J. Tejan Jr. in Tejan's own house. After stopping by under the pretense of car trouble, Bryant shot Tejan multiple times, then tortured him horrifically, burning the man's eyes with lit cigarettes and arranging lit candles around the body. In a final act of depravity, Bryant used Tejan's blood to scrawl taunting messages on the wall, including one that read victim number 4 in 2 weeks, catch me if you can. He even answered Tejan's phone when the victim's worried daughter called, chillingly identifying himself only as the Prowler, while admitting he had killed her father. And Bryant was not done. 2 days after Tejan's murder, on October 13, 2004, he crossed paths with 35-year-old Christopher Burgess at a convenience store and killed him as well, dumping Burgess's body in a remote area. In the span of a week, 3 men were dead, each life taken in cold blood. Bryant also shot at a 4th victim, Clinton Brown, who was fishing near the Watery Rive, but he survived the encounter. Investigators quickly zeroed in on Steven Bryant. Confronted with the weight of evidence, Bryant pleaded guilty in 2008 to the murders, thereby avoiding a jury trial. Instead, a South Carolina judge held a sentencing hearing, during which the gruesome details were recounted for the record. On September 11, 2008, Judge Thomas Russo imposed the death penalty on Bryant for the murder of Willard Tejan. Bryant received additional sentences for the other killings, but Tejan's case was the one that formally put him on death row. At 23 years old, He became one of the youngest inmates condemned to South Carolina's death row at that time. Over the next 17 years, Bryant's legal team fought to save his life. They pointed to a history of trauma and mental impairment. Bryant's mother abused alcohol and drugs while pregnant, allegedly causing him fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and he endured sexual abuse and severe neglect throughout his childhood. His attorneys argued that this background left him psychologically damaged. In appeals, they contended that a more thorough investigation into his mental health, including brain scans, might have influenced the sentencing outcome. However, the courts were unpersuaded. In a unanimous decision issued just days before the execution, the South Carolina Supreme Court ruled that even if Bryant had brain damage or a traumatic past, his crimes showed a high level of planning and cruelty that would have led to a death sentence regardless. Earlier in October 2025, the U.S. Supreme Court had also declined to review Bryant's case, removing the last federal hurdle. South Carolina's governor did not grant clemency. No governor in the state has ever commuted a modern death sentence, so the execution was set to proceed. Unlike most executions in the United States, Bryant's impending death gave him a choice of method. South Carolina law, lacking lethal injection drugs, allows inmates to select electrocution or firing squad. Bryant opted for the firing squad, a method practically unseen in the U.S. for over a decade until South Carolina revived it in 2025. On November 14th, he was led into the execution chamber wearing a prison jumpsuit with a target pinned over his heart. In place of a last telephone call or final prayer, Bryant had one last decision: his final meal. According to prison officials, he requested a lavish spread: mixed seafood stir-fry, fried fish over rice, egg rolls, stuffed shrimp, 2 candy bars, and German chocolate cake. It was a far cry from the sparse prison fare he had eaten for years. Witnesses to the execution included members of the victims' families and media. As Bryant stood bound to a chair, a hood was placed over his head. When asked if he had any final words, he made no statement. At 6 p.m. Eastern Time, 3 volunteer marksmen raised their rifles. A bright yellow target over Bryant's chest marked the spot. At 6:05 p.m., Steven Bryant was pronounced dead, becoming the third person executed by firing squad in South Carolina in 2025. The state had not used this method in modern history until that year. By carrying out Bryant's sentence in this manner, South Carolina underlined its determination to enforce capital punishment despite pharmaceutical shortages for lethal injections. In the aftermath, South Carolina officials noted that Bryant was the 5th person executed in the state in 2025, a sharp uptick after a 10-year de facto pause on executions before they resumed in mid-2024. His execution was also the state's 50th since the U.S. Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty in the 1970s. As the sun set outside Broad River Prison that evening, protesters against the death penalty held vigils, while others, including some victims' relatives, felt that justice for the 2004 rampage had at long last been served. The haunting image of a killer who once wrote "Catch me if you can" in his victim's blood now ends with a stark finality. He was caught, and the ultimate punishment was carried out. 1 week later, the focus returned to Florida for yet another execution, one that would break an all-time record for the state and bring a measure of closure to a case dating back to the 1980s. Richard Barry Randolph, November 20th, 2025, Florida. The final execution in the U.S. that November took place on November 20th, 2025, again at Florida State Prison. Richard Barry Randolph, age 63, was put to death by lethal injection for a brutal murder committed 37 years earlier. At 6:12 p.m. that Thursday, Randolph was pronounced dead. The 17th execution carried out by Florida in 2025, extending a new single-year record for the state. Richard Randolph's crime dates back to August 15, 1988, in the town of East Palatka, Florida. Randolph, then 26 years old, hatched a plan to rob the Handyway convenience store where he had once worked. Early that morning, he bicycled to the store armed with a knife and even a toy gun, intending to sneak in and steal around $1,000 from a safe. The store's manager, 55-year-old Minnie Ruth McCullum, was outside checking the gas pumps, an opportunity Randolph thought he could exploit. But McCullum returned inside sooner than expected and caught Randolph in the act of prying at the safe. What happened next was horrific. Randolph attacked McCullum, viciously beating her and strangling her with a sweatshirt drawstring until she lost consciousness. When she stirred and screamed, he responded with greater violence. He stabbed her repeatedly with a knife. In a twisted attempt to mislead investigators, Randolph later admitted he sexually raped the gravely wounded woman to make it look like a maniac had committed the crime. Believing McCullum was dead or dying, Randolph dragged her to a back room. He then tore down the store's security camera, gathered up the day's cash, and also stole lottery tickets from a counter. After pocketing the money and tickets, he took the keys from McCullum's desk and fled in her car, locking the store behind him. By a stroke of fate, 3 women arrived at the gas station around this time and noticed something amiss. They saw Randolph, whom they vaguely recognized, locking up and leaving, and he told them the manager wasn't there because her car had broken down. The women's suspicions were aroused, especially after they peered through the store window and saw chaos inside, shelves knocked over, wires dangling. They promptly called the sheriff's office. Deputies forced their way in and discovered Minnie McCullum clinging to life in a back room, bleeding from severe head and neck wounds. She had been beaten so badly that she fell into a coma. Tragically, despite doctors' efforts, McCullum died 6 days later in the hospital from irreversible brain injuries. Meanwhile, an all-points bulletin went out for Richard Randolph. He didn't get far. Later that same day, Randolph turned up at a grocery store in Jacksonville, trying to borrow some cash, and notably, attempting to redeem the stolen lottery tickets for quick money. Police arrested him there without incident. Confronted by detectives, Randolph confessed to the attack and even led officers to where he had discarded his blood-stained clothing. The case against him was ironclad. In February 1989, Richard Randolph went on trial for first-degree murder, armed robbery, sexual battery, and grand theft auto. The evidence of his guilt was overwhelming, and a Putnam County jury returned a guilty verdict. When it came to the penalty phase, 8 out of 12 jurors recommended the death penalty. Florida law at the time did not require a unanimous jury for death. On April 5, 1989, the trial judge formally sentenced Randolph to death for the murder of Minnie McCullum. Randolph was 27 years old, and he joined Florida's death row, where he would remain for nearly 36 years. Over those decades, Randolph pursued appeals through state and federal courts, but every appeal was denied. He raised various claims, from challenges to how evidence was handled, to procedural issues, and later to the contention that his lawyers acted without his consent on some matters, but none convinced any court to overturn his sentence. By 2025, he had exhausted his standard appeals and post-conviction remedies. Governor Ron DeSantis signed Randolph's death warrant on October 21, 2025, scheduling the execution for November 20th. In the weeks before the date, Randolph sought a stay by arguing about access to public records and his attorney's actions, but the Florida Supreme Court rejected those last-minute appeals on November 7, 2025. On the morning of his execution day, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to intervene, removing the final barrier. As the sun set on November 20, 2025, a small crowd of witnesses assembled at Union Correctional Institution, the site of Florida's execution chamber. Randolph, who had converted to Islam in prison and taken the name Malik Abdul Sajjad in an attempt to find spiritual meaning, declined a final visit from a religious advisor on his last day. Instead, he spent his final hours quietly. For his last meal, Randolph chose a simple comfort food menu: a cheeseburger with fries, eggs, a soda, and ice cream. Strapped to the gurney in the execution chamber, Randolph was asked if he had any final words. He replied that he had none. The witness room remained silent as the execution proceeded. At 6 p.m., the chemical flow began. By 6:12 p.m., the attending physician pronounced Randolph dead. The curtain that had concealed the lethal injection process was drawn back right at 6 o'clock, and within minutes Randolph's eyes closed, his face twitching slightly as the sedative, paralytic, and heart-stopping drugs took effect. A guard gave the customary shake and shout, "Richard Randolph," with no response. It was over. Florida Department of Corrections officials noted that the execution took place without incident or complication. In a brief statement afterward, a DOC spokesperson relayed a message from Minnie McCollum's family. They asked him to publicly thank Governor DeSantis on their behalf for seeing the sentence through. For the victims' loved ones, justice delayed was not justice denied, not in the end. Richard Randolph's execution was the 44th execution in the United States in 2025 up to that point. In fact, 2025 marked the highest number of executions in a single year in over a decade. Florida alone, with 17 executions, had far surpassed its previous annual record. Other states like South Carolina, Alabama, and Texas followed with smaller numbers. November 2025 encapsulated this grim resurgence of capital punishment. 3 men, 3 heinous crimes from the past, all brought to their legally mandated end in the span of 8 days. In this short window of time, we saw the conclusion of 3 long and painful stories. Each case involved innocent lives taken and families devastated, and each wound its way through the justice system for decades. Bryan Frederick Jennings, who stole the life of a little girl, met a quiet end after 46 years. Corey Bryant, whose bloody rampage shocked a community, faced a firing squad, a method as stark as his crimes. Richard Barry Randolph, who brutally murdered a woman who had once been his boss, was finally held to account after outliving his victim by nearly 4 decades. These executions in November 2025 remind us of the somber weight of justice. Justice for victims and their families, the fulfillment of sentences pronounced long ago, and the ongoing debate about capital punishment in America. It is a chapter of history written in the lives of those lost and the consequences met, never to be forgotten. Thank you for watching. Please stay tuned for our next report, and until then, take care of one another.